Hello, everybody. I'm ZKast from ZK Research, and I'm here with another ZKast video. I'm joined today by Run Almog, Head of Product Strategy for a company, pretty interesting company called DriveNets. As always, these ZKasts are done in conjunction with my media partner, eWEEK, so hope you enjoy watching and reading the story. Run, hello, and welcome to ZKast. Why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your background and what exactly DriveNets is?
Hi, Zeus. Thank you for the introduction. To start with myself, I've been, dealing with disaggregated networks for roughly a decade or even a bit more, coming off the areas of data center and now stepping into service provider with DriveNets. DriveNets is in this business to make a revolution into something that hasn't really been or has been very stagnant for over 20 years, and with that, introducing a new concept of establishing the network as an infrastructure, just like cloud was established, and it kind of revolutionized compute. So DriveNet is in a way doing the same things for the networking space.
Right. Yeah. So you guys, from what I understand, you make a disaggregated router. Now, routers. When you think about routers are one of the most mature technologies in all of IT. In fact, I started my career as a network engineer back in the late 80s, and I was working on, the very early days of routers, which are, you could argue they're routers, switches, bridges, whatever. But as long as we've been connecting things, we've had routers. Now, so what's going on in networking today that warrants this change? And you even said that it's been around like, these 20, 30 years old, some of these products, right? So why does routing now need to be reinvented?
The thing about routers is that they've been doing a good job. Over the last 2 decades plus, they have been doing a good job, but it's just not good enough. And the way that the networks are being consumed these days is changing, while the infrastructure or the building blocks remain the same. So the same vendors are building the same types of boxes, and these boxes are being placed into the network in a similar manner, only that the network is being consumed in a totally different way. The way that services are running up top, over the top of the network, bring the revenue to a different place than where the service providers are. And service providers are then facing a critical juncture of how they see their revenue growth or the trajectory of the revenue growth, because it's shrinking and it's actually shifting into other places. The same logic was applied to the world of compute or servers. In the formation of the cloud is doing a much better job in building an infrastructure which is more flexible and more scalable, just by the principles of building a cloud, virtualization, simplified hardware, the cloud native software of it, and it establishes a model which produces better TCO, and that is the way for the service providers to kind of twist that revenue curve backwards to be in a positive direction.
Yeah, I think it's been pretty well documented that every time we increase speeds and we add more services to our networks, the service providers wind up spending more, but they don't actually wind up making more. So I suppose this is a way to help them drive their costs down so they can actually make a little bit of money and maybe provide a little bit better service. So, I saw on your website that you guys say that you build networks like clouds. Right now, that's kind of an interesting concept. Typically, you build networks like networks, but what do you mean by that you build networks like cloud, and what are the benefits to your customers for doing that?
When building something like a cloud, or when building the cloud, there are certain pillars or principles of from an architectural or from an engineering standpoint. Software and hardware are then decoupled. It's not just one single block, one single element. The hardware is not considered as a single entity, but it's kind of a resource. And this resource is then being virtualized and consumed as a resource, as opposed to kind of a monolith type of a router concept. The software piece is something which is by definition built to something that can run on several locations, so it can scale better. What's known as cloud native type of the software. All of these combined eventually allow an infrastructure which can scale on the hardware level coming from the boxes themselves, on the service level coming from the software piece or the software part of it, and of course from the utilization level coming from the abstraction of the hardware or the virtualization of it. So it allows every software element to consume the right resources which it needs in order to operate properly and to scale to the required capacity of the network. All of this eventually boils down into something which builds a better TCO of the model, something which is more elastic in its scaling. It can scale up, it can scale down. And eventually this infrastructure is something that establishes the ability to innovate, because then you can innovate on software alone without being tightly coupled to specific hardware. And this separation of planes is what enables faster innovation and faster introduction of new services. This is exactly what happened in the cloud, and this is exactly what we are doing, and therefore we are saying that we are building networks like cloud.
Yeah, in fact, I think your analogy to what happened in computes, they're pretty appropriate, because once we managed to decouple the hardware and software in the cloud, innovation just took off, right? So you see people doing stuff with compute that you never let you do before, and I actually do like that analogy. So now, you when you introduced yourself, you said you've been doing disaggregation for the better part of a decade. It seems like as an industry, we've been talking about disaggregation forever, right? And everyone, it's a little bit like the cloud. Everyone's got their own definition of it. So what exactly does disaggregation mean? How do you define it?
All right. So we look at disaggregation from perhaps three perspectives. The first is this separation of hardware from software, and perhaps I wouldn't call it the easy part, but it's the easier part of things. Supporting a white box is not too complicated. These interfaces have been well defined, and establishing a software that is able to interface with these defined or standardized interfaces, it's not rocket science. It's proper engineering, and it's been done, as I already noted, for over a decade. The next tier to that is what we have been doing is we took two monolith elements and we disaggregated both. First off is the actual chassis, which we kind of removed the metal enclosure, which was limiting that chassis or limiting its potential from extracting the vast capabilities of its infrastructure, the ASICs inside that are building it. And we removed that, and we in a way replaced it with a virtual one. So every basic element of the chassis is now a standalone device, and you can essentially build any scale you want of these elements. So from that perspective, everything to do with scale comes into place. And then we took the software piece and we built it in a way that can run on multiple devices. This is the cloud nativeness, containerized form factor of the software and how it is reading. Obviously, we also needed to rewrite the entire routing stack as just to make it work. So there's a lot of engineering effort behind these three tiers of building disaggregation. Eventually, what we enabled ourselves to do is to create a clear separation between the data plane and the control plane. And once this happens, first off, decoupling and obviously no vendor lock, and there is a lot of control at the hands of the customer, the service provider himself, in terms of what does he insert or allow admission into his network. And then eventually the ability to scale to the exact need, decoupling the scale of the service, which is in certain areas of the network is the key issue, and the scale of the capacity, which in other parts of the network is the issue. Allowing the disconnect from these two elements are the key benefits of this separation between data plane and control plane. This is how disaggregation is from the perspective of DriveNets.
All right. So disaggregation isn't what some of the vendors are doing, where they just simply sell you the same box, but they license the software differently. Right? I've seen that.
Well, it is. I mean, you can call disaggregation whatever you want, but eventually it's like tier one disaggregation, and there is some value to it. But when you look at tier 3 of disaggregation, then you see that the value is much, much higher. And then there is real impact and gravity of the solution to drive a change in the industry.
Yeah, no, I was saying that a little tongue in cheek, and again, I'll go back to your analogy of the cloud. I remember the early days of cloud, some vendors would talk about if they just hosted storage or hosted a server, they'd consider that cloud. I mean, it kind of is cloud, but it doesn't really give you all the benefits, right? So if you're selling a vertically integrated solution and you're just licensing it differently, I guess that's disaggregation, but it doesn't really give you the same benefits that you do. So, by the way, I did notice, and actually I covered this in one of my ZKasts earlier, that DriveNets reached unicorn status. So congratulations on that. In fact, you stand up, I think you have your unicorn shirt on, right?
Yeah, I got my unicorn shirt. See?
Yeah, very nice. Yeah. So congratulations on that. Now, there have been, as an analyst, I can't tell you how many vendors that claim to do disaggregation have reached out to me in the past. None of them, not one of them, have had near the success you have. I don't think any of them even come close to reaching unicorn status, right? So what exactly have you done differently that none of those other vendors who really pushed this market hard, and some had some really good backers, good founders and stuff, but they never had the success you did. So what are you doing differently?
Well, let me start by one thing. AT&T and the fact that we're building the largest core network in America is definitely a contributor to that, right? You typically don't see startups with this kind of customers, and definitely not installed into such a critical area of the network. And this has a great impact to it. What Network Cloud is doing is establishing an infrastructure. And on top of this infrastructure, you can run, in fact, any type of a routing service. What we're doing with AT&T is just one example. But when you extrapolate that, you see that aggregation routing or peering or access routing or edge routing, all of these are, from our perspective, just additional routing services which can be mounted on the same infrastructure. So in terms of market potential or prospect or target market, all of these apply. So wherever you have a type of a network solution that can run or typically would run on routers, for us, it's a potential target market. So that's from the perspective of the market potential or the business, the financial potential of the company, which is one driver. The other is obviously the engineering obstacle that we passed in order to reach that level. Like I said before, taking the chassis, breaking it into its standalone separate elements, kind of ungrouping it, decoupling from the metal enclosure, and then regrouping it using some sort of a virtualized overlayer or abstraction system to merge all these pieces together and make them behave and look and be managed and operated as a single device in the network is unique. And it's a huge engineering effort. So once this effort has been, stated and kind of demonstrated as something which is already behind us, and obviously separates us from all the others, putting us on par, in fact, with a few vendors who are providing these service provider routing networks for the last 2 decades, really made an impact from the investment perspective.
Yeah, well, you certainly picked the hardest of the hard customers, right? A lot of the early disaggregated vendors, as you mentioned, focused on data center, top of rack, areas like that, where it didn't have quite the same demands. Now, speaking of demands, some of the skeptics of disaggregation, in fact, I was one of those, I'll admit that, until I actually did that event with you guys a little while ago. Disaggregation historically, anyways, has been thought of as a product that you use when performance is not an issue, but then when performance is an issue, use vertically integrated hardware software because the makers of those boxes say you can't really outperform that. So what's your response? Can you get the same level of performance as you can at one of the traditional vendors?
Well, absolutely, yes. I'd say everything that you run in a service provider network is either one of four things. Perhaps it's either performance savvy, a candidate to become performance savvy, experimental, something which is really there for testing something, or something which is short-lived, because if it's not performance capable, it will simply not survive. So everything running in service provider networks is by definition performance savvy. I'll kind of take you back perhaps a decade to a question that I was asked in my previous life about disaggregation, and when asked, who does it fit? I mean, what kind of customer is a suitable customer for this type of decoupling between hardware and software? And I answered that the question is not what kind of customers, but when. And from a timeline perspective, eventually this will evolve into everywhere in any type of a network, because it simply makes sense. Now, once we have taken this and kind of taken it to tier 2, tier 3 of disaggregation and making the network operate just like a cloud, just like an infrastructure, then everything to do with performance coming from the cloud is being assumed by our type of solution. Now, it's true to say that when you vertically integrate all the elements into one enclosure, then there is some benefit to that. But there is also a kind of a large caveat, because when you're vertically integrating all of it into one enclosure, you're making a lot of assumptions, and you're making a lot of assumptions in terms of what kind of application will eventually be running on that type of an enclosure. And this also means that a lot of the resources that you put into that enclosure are not being used at any given time, because the type of application running on it is specific to other resources. And merging multiple applications on the same enclosure is practically impossible, or definitely not something which is promoted by companies who are making their business on selling hardware. Once the infrastructure is in place and our software is able to abstract all these resources and consume them like a cloud application would consume resources, then we are reaching higher utilization rates of any type of a resource in the network. Now, resources can mean a lot of things, not just bandwidth. It can mean TCAM entries or CPU cycles or counters or policers. There are a lot of elements, and with the different use cases that we are providing, we are able to reach higher utilization levels in an average than any standalone vertically integrated monolithic enclosure. So from a perspective of pure performance, in fact, network cloud is better performing any monolithic router.
Yeah, that's sort of an interesting thesis in that if you think about like the world of IT and technology, right? Almost every area that storage, compute, whatever applications has seen a significant boost in performance because of the cloud, right? Except networking. That's been kind of the one holdout where we really haven't evolved to that model. But I suppose companies like yourself are actually helping us make this bridge now, so we get the same kind of effect that everywhere else has gotten in the cloud, right? So I think the early days of virtualization, people used to say you couldn't really get the same level of performance out of virtualization as you can, out of physical servers. But now nobody even thinks about that anymore. So now you had mentioned AT&T before. I know they're your marquee customer. They were mentioned in the press release around your unicorn status and the round of funding. Can you share with me who some of your other customers are, or at least what types of customers they are, why they chose you?
Yeah, well, true. AT&T, a key customer, and in fact, the only one that we can talk about publicly, and this is kind of already a well-known what we're doing over there and building their core network. We have engagements with other tier 1 service providers, actually roughly 30 service providers with which we are engaged with in various levels of engagement. Obviously, all of these cycles are long cycles, and they have started, a while back. Whenever a service provider is looking at his revenue curve or revenue per bit versus cost per bit, and he sees how these two curves are close to meeting each other, then he realizes that he needs to make a change. Now, this has been attempted, this concept of transformation has been attempted, or at least the problem has been there by or observed by service providers for, I'd say, 10 to 15 years back. And they have been trying to find a solution to that. And this is the type of customers that we see. So it's a lot of tier ones who kind of see the problem in the large scale, wherever they are. And they also have the capacity to kind of plunge into a new technology, test it, certify it's working for them, and obviously shape in a way the roadmap into their direction. So we have a few of such customers. And then we have other tier twos who are looking kind of and waiting behind the curve to see the first tier ones who are going public with this. Some of it is already kind of rumored out, beyond AT&T. So the tier twos, the industry have their way to find out things, even when they're not properly announced. So the tier twos are kind of waiting and to see that this is actually working before they kind of plunge into it. We have a few engagements with those as well. And then, of course, any kind of service providers who is on the innovation path, like greenfielders. And perhaps the last item is, I would say, large cloud providers who really need capacity. They just need a lot of ports, a lot of interfaces, and supporting actually the highest or the largest router in the world is something that really appeals to them. This is something that we do, and this is what's triggering our engagement with the large cloud providers.
Yeah, I would imagine that you're AT&T, one of the biggest service providers in the world, and that all the other tier ones probably took notice. And you mentioned you're working with 30 of them. There's really not many more than that tier one. So I think some of the names I could probably guess who you're working with. So I've heard those.
We cannot name the names, sadly, but you can guess. You can guess.
Yeah. Now you mentioned transformation, and I think one of the biggest transformations we've seen in service provider networks, maybe ever, has been this upcoming wave of 5G rollouts. Right, every service provider is trying to compete in that area. So 5G is obviously faster. We got 400 gig going. Does that actually accelerate the need for a disaggregation solution?
Well, yes. 5G is by definition a concept that disaggregates controlling user planes, and this really aligns itself to what we're doing with network cloud. By the very basic elements or pillars of the architecture. So that's one thing. And then when it comes to 5G, a service needs to be kind of provisioned throughout the network. There are attributes to do with ultra low latency requirement of the service, and therefore the service termination point needs to get itself closer to the subscribers, and the infrastructure needs to be there in order to support all of that. So it's not just building a single device that is enabled with the ability to decouple hardware from software or control plane from data plane, but also the ability to scale, because once again, 5G brings in a lot more bandwidth than previous generations have. So 5G is triggering a lot of inputs or more requirements from the network. And when it comes to a network which has a lot of flexibility in it, and in fact is an infrastructure to mount multiple services on top of it, then 5G is definitely a trigger or a propeller that drives this industry forward. There is always this talk about 5G and the edge, or the edge compute, and how these two meet up together. And is it the same term, just with different names? There's a lot of talk of this, and there is a lot of correlation between these two elements, perhaps two drivers pushing from two opposite directions, and eventually meet at kind of a climax point, which in a way mandates, again, a platform which is flexible, a platform which enables services to be mounted on top of it, a platform that can host the application itself and enable the other side of innovation. Let's take an example an IoT service which can be triggered by 5G, there needs to be a correlating, reliable network behind the scenes that connects all the dots and into the control function of this IoT function, and this entity needs to be hosted on something. This something is very up close into the network, and this is exactly where network cloud comes into play. So yeah, definitely 5G is something which is pushing us forward.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the misconceptions of 5G is it's not just speed, right? But there's a whole bunch of additional services that can be offered on top. So that's pretty exciting. So anyways, Run, I think we're at the end of our time. I want to thank you for joining me here on the Thought Leadership Series. And I just want to say, if you're watching this, I know disaggregation, again, has been around a long time, but I personally believe it's real this time. I think the cloudification of the rest of the IT stack is a pretty good early indicator of where networking is going. So if you're new to the term, I certainly recommend that you do your education on this, because I think no matter what size network you have, disaggregation is obviously going to come to a network near you sometime soon. So Run, on behalf of you and DriveNets, I want to thank you very much for joining me on the ZKast video. And again, I want to thank my partner eWEEK for hosting this as well. Thanks.
My pleasure, Zeus. Thanks for having us.